Ready to the Code Update Committee's fourth public meeting, and we're going to talk tonight about Phase 4, so welcome. I'd like to introduce the Code Update Committee. Karen Doyle is right here. Nora Hart is on our injured list. Paul Henderson is right here. Anna Pellizzeri is on the ill list. And Michael Reisman is right here. My name is Marie Early, and I'm the Village Board Liaison to the Code Update Committee. What I'd like to do, could you sign in, sir? Oh, you're here.
We forgot to cancel our cleaning guy, so.
Okay. I'd like to ask you to hold your questions until the end of the presentation, and we'll take care of them then. So, a brief history. The comprehensive plan was adopted by the village in 2012. The local waterfront revitalization strategy was completed in 2011. This seems reversed. It took a while to get the comprehensive plan adopted. It required a state review, a review by the village board, public hearing by the village board, and then approval from the Department of State. So that took until 2012. Meanwhile, the comprehensive plans, the special board comprehensive plan / LWRS began on the LWRS, and that got completed in 2011. The LWRS did not require village board approval or DOS approval, so that one was fairly straightforward. The special board went on to work on the local waterfront revitalization program, which was completed in 2014. The Department of State did not approve due to what they said were a lack of zoning items that were implemented in our code. And so they left it at that. The DOS approval is required for the LWRP. So in 2014, the village board obtained a grant, thanks to Stephanie Hawkins, from NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority, to address 29 specific village code topics. Some of them are in zoning, some of them are in other places within the code. And the village board formed the Code Update Committee to perform the work of addressing the 29 topics. The Code Update Committee has as its charter to review and recommend actions on the 29 topics defined by NYSERDA, which are subset into 5 different categories. 3 public meetings have been held thus far on the categories of use, appearance, and environment. All the meeting materials for those 3 meetings are available on the village website, and the materials from tonight, both the presentation and the handouts, are also available on the village website. Go to boards and committees, go to CUC, go to public meetings, and there you will see Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, Phase 4. Click on that and you'll find all the materials. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to obtain public input on Category 4, which is the procedures category. We'll take any verbal input that you have tonight. If you want to provide written comments, please feel free to do so. They will be accepted until May 3rd. They can be sent to me at Trustee Early at coldspringny.gov or to the village office at 85 Main Street. Attention, Code Update Committee. So very quickly, the topics for Phase 1 are in the use category. There they are. The Phase 1 public meeting was held on August 6th, 2016. The Phase 2 categories, Phase 2 category topics are appearances. That public meeting was held on November 29th, 2017. The Phase 3 topics, environment, that meeting was held on August 20th, 2018. There's one topic remaining, which is consistency and clarity, and there are 2 topics within that category. Amend the village code for clarity and consistency, and develop or revise the village's zoning map to be consistent with the 29 topics that have already been discussed and any other changes to the map that have been identified as being appropriate to implement. We don't yet have a date for that, but we are working to get to the point of having Phase 5 public meeting, performing the secret, and having the village board have a public hearing on all of the code updates by year end. So tonight's meeting has to do with procedures. There are 5 topics, and there they are. Notice that many of them are evaluate. When NYSERDA identifies a topic called with the word evaluate in it, it means we have to consider that and then either implement something that addresses that or identify why we are choosing not to do that in the code. So the only one that is not like that is amend subdivision regs. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go into evaluate permitting conservation easements and facade easements. The way we approach this topic is we looked at what the comprehensive plan and the LWR said about conservation and facade easements, providing a definition for conservation easement, a definition for facade easement, and ask the question, is it feasible for the village to adopt either one of these? And then you'll see what the Code Update Committee has concluded on that. So, in the small print here are the sections from the LWRP, the comprehensive plan first, and then the LWRS, where they talk about the topic of conservation easements or facade easements. So you see in italics, I've highlighted conservation easement and facade easements. You will not be tested on the content of this particular slide tonight. The next slide continues that which is stated in the comprehensive plan in the LWRS about conservation easements and facade easements. So that's what the comprehensive plan and the LWRS say about those 2 topics. What are they? What are conservation easements and what are facade easements? A conservation easement is a legal agreement between 2 parties to set aside some land for the purposes of conserving the elements of the land. One is motivated to establish a conservation easement because you get a tax write-off. The law requires that a conservation easement be granted to a land trust. And I'll talk about 2 land trusts that are in our area and the relationship that the village has with them. There is a requirement when there is a conservation easement given that annually the land must be inspected to confirm that the owner of the land is adhering to the principles of the conservation easement. That's what a conservation easement is, and the conservation easement goes with the land. So if you sell the land, the owner of the new purchaser of the land will have the same conservation easement restrictions on their land. A facade easement is different, a little different. It's a grant or donation of historic property to a qualified organization for preserving the historic fabric or character of the facade. The easement serves to preserve the character of the building. The burden of preserving the building stays with the owner. It doesn't go onto the organization to whom the facade easement has been granted. So there is a financial obligation on the part of the owner of the building on facade easement. Also for facade easement, it goes with the life of the building. So for perpetuity, you have the responsibility of doing this. The village code is silent currently about both facade easements and conservation easements. So we're very fortunate in the village to have 2 very, very good and very responsible land trust organizations, Hudson Highlands Land Trust and Scenic Hudson. In fact, there have been conservation easements that have been granted within the village with no requirement for any legislative change. So the current code does not prohibit them, by being silent, in effect, it says, if you two people want to set up a conservation easement and you're a qualified land trust, go at it, you have our blessing. So one could argue that there's no need to get involved in that. The Village of Cold Spring was also fortunate to be the recipient of a conservation easement on behalf of Hudson Highlands Land Trust, where a water source was identified and an easement was obtained by Hudson Highlands Land Trust for the Village of Cold Spring to have access to and use the water in that water source. I'm going to say that that happened 5 to 10 years ago, more than 5 years ago, probably 10 years ago. So that's an asset that the village has. In addition, establishing a conservation easement legislation requires that if the village were to become the obtainer of a conservation easement, the village would be responsible for establishing the annual review of the property to make sure it conforms to the principles of the conservation easement. So it's a cost, a skill level that would be a burden on the village. Relative to facade easements, I could find no qualified organization who would be a recipient of a facade easement. What a facade easement does is it gives the owner of the building an immediate tax write-off and lowers their assessment. So it has an impact, a negative impact on the tax base, facade easements. The owner of the building gets that tax write-off, but then the owner of the building must maintain the facade of the building according to the standards that are required for that facade. Again, the village is very fortunate to have a very active architectural and historic review board. We also are fortunate because we have both a local and a national historic district. The village code has a very strong Chapter 64 that addresses what can and cannot be done to buildings in the local and national district. So our conclusion was that, if we can go on to the next one, we looked at both conservation of facade easements, and for the reasons above, we do not recommend amending the code in any fashion to address facade and conservation easements. We think that we are already very well protected. Okay. Next topic, demolition. Demolition is mentioned in the village code. It says you have to apply for a building permit. And as it turns out, there's no such thing as a demolition permit. You get a building permit and you check the demolition box. What is demolition? It's the act of pulling down, destroying, razing a building with substantial destruction. And I believe that the handouts say 80% or more. At least 80% of the building has, you would demolish if you were tearing down 80% of the building. We felt that there's probably an opportunity here to strengthen the village and protect the residents and visitors to the village by having a demolition chapter in the village code. So the demolition chapter, which is in the handouts, talks about things like rodent control. If you're demolishing a building, what is the owner of the building's plan for rodent control? What is the owner's plan for other aspects of the safety and well-being of our neighborhoods? So it seemed to us that we're going to recommend that we make a change, chapter 134, it's in your handouts with the wording. So this would be 134 this would apply to all districts, all zoning districts. It would be 18, 19, 20, something like that, 134-18, 19, or 20. We will state in that update that if the building to be demolished is within the historic, local or national historic district, that Chapter 64 applies. Chapter 64 is the Historic District Review Board, and they have very stringent criteria for what can and cannot be demolished. So we're going to let them run with that, not impose anything in addition to that. So this would only apply to properties outside of the two districts. For the exact wording, please see in your handout, there'll be a section on demolition. Okay, with that, we move to conservation subdivisions, and Karen will take over. I'll take over.
So Marie had a lot of nice, good things to say about conservation easements, so that was great. So keep that, some of the stuff she talked about in mind on this topic. So here we followed a similar procedure where first we looked at what do the comprehensive plan and the LWRS say about conservation subdivisions. Then we said, what is a conservation subdivision? Because we didn't really, I mean, I knew, but the rest of the folks didn't know, so we talked about that so you can understand what they are. And what are the possible areas in the village where a conservation subdivision might even be considered? And then, similar to the other topics, is it feasible for the village to adopt a conservation subdivision code provision? And then we have a discussion, we discussed it, and there were conclusions that we'll cover. Okay, next slide. So get out your reading glasses. So in the comprehensive plan and the LWRS, let's see, I can get to the part that's, Objective 7.1, ensure that proposed plans for any property that because of its size, location, or historic significance is of special importance to the village are in compliance with this comprehensive plan and LWRS and open to public review. So under that objective were some recommendations. Where such property is being developed, if you drop down to the third bullet point, that's where this instruction comes from, to consider amending the subdivision regulations and zoning law to permit conservation subdivisions. The reference there to the four-step design process that identifies unbuildable lands and special features of the site around which development is designed is found in the village law. Next slide. Which we talk about later. Also on page 130 of the LWRS, again, specifically talking about what's been referred to in the comp plan and in the LWRS as the Kemble Ridge. So I'm sure most of the people in this room are familiar with the West Point Foundry Preserve. When you walk along the trail from the parking area towards the railroad tracks, there's a, we covered this, if anyone was here for our Ridgeline Protection Overlay District topic last time, ridges are generally, you don't think of a ridge, but we called it that. So Kemble Ridge is what it was called in the LWRS. It's about 40 feet high, maybe 40 to 60 feet high. But in our public input sessions during the creation of the comprehensive plan and the LWRS, the topic came up and village residents supported protecting the views of Kemble Ridge. And also is identified as a contributing feature in the Cold Spring Scenic Area of statewide significance. So that's really where this idea came from. Was just like, well, how could we address that support and what people thought about that site? Also, in the planning process for the comprehensive plan, there is some remnants of, if anyone, is it Kemble's home, Gouverneur Kemble? Is that whether there's some? Maybe in that area there might be some archaeological resources. So this idea of maybe look at conservation subdivision came up. Okay, next slide. And another reference again, cluster development is another name for conservation subdivision. The village law, New York State village law section I was talking about is section 7-738, where that lays out the four-step process and all of that. And what the purpose is when you're looking at something and considering a conservation development, it's looking at livability and natural resource protection. Okay, next slide. So what is a conservation subdivision? And Marie, you had a nice summary in here. There's a great book by Randall Arndt, which talks about conservation subdivisions, and I just love this visual because it really shows you what they are. So on one hand, you can have your typical loop road with these large lots, and in a conservation subdivision, there's a lot of planning and thought that goes into identifying, where there might be natural resources and places where you want to keep open spaces. And then you can see where that term cluster development comes from, because you're going to cluster the homes in certain places and keep other areas open. And you look at these two things and you're thinking, oh, there's more houses here and less here, but it's really not true. It's the same number of home sites on the same 130-acre property. So it's really a design tool, which you get your livability, but you also get your protection of natural resources. Next slide. So the next thing we had to do, okay, now we know what a conservation subdivision is. We know that it was mentioned in the LWRS and the comp plan. So we sat around and we said, okay, where would something like that happen? You need a significant amount of property. You need vacant land. You need natural resources that you're looking to protect. We kind of came up with maybe what if Haldane closed and there's all that property and there's the fields and all of that. And then the other thing that popped into our minds was the marathon site. We consulted with our planning consultant, Green Plan, who also assisted us in the development of the comprehensive plan in the LWRS. And he really said, the only remotely possible place which was cited in the comp plan is the marathon property. Next slide. So with that, we concluded that, 40 to 70 feet. So we looked at that and we said, okay, Kemble Ridge was mentioned. Again, it's the 40 to 70 feet area over the walking path. It's mentioned in the plan in the LWRS. We think about, okay, the development base. Talking to Green Plan, what would it take to implement something like that? Is it, the process, is it costly? Is it worth it? Change the code? Is that site what's intended with the conservation subdivision regarding natural resource protection? So we had all these discussions and thought about it, and in consultation with our planner, the conclusion was there really are better tools available to protect specific property features, such as conservation easements, which Marie just gave a nice lesson on what those are, and local enforcement of the scenic areas of statewide significant policies, which I believe we're going to talk about tonight in another topic. Okay, next slide. So our conclusion was a conservation subdivision code provision is not appropriate for the village of Cold Spring based upon limited lands in the village that could support conservation subdivision, that it is a costly process to implement and would not necessarily protect Kemble Ridge. There are other processes or methods that are more suitable and could be applied to other areas of that property. So our conclusion was to recommend no changes to the village code, not to address that issue, but to not, for this purpose, would we update our code to include a conservation subdivision section? And we decided to recommend the answer be no. But to recommend that the village board pursue a different remedy, such as exploring conservation easements and or local enforcement of the scenic areas of statewide significant guidelines. Thank you.
All right, this is where we get controversial. Just kidding. Just want to make sure everyone's awake. So I like to think of this as the sassy topic. Karen gave a little preview. The New York Scenic Area of Statewide Significance regulations, which we'll get into in just a moment. But SASS, sassy, you're with me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I think it's fair to say that there's a thematic connection between a number of the topics tonight, and that's probably no accident because the topics for the entirety of the Code Update Committee's work were drawn from the comprehensive plan and the LWRS, on which Karen, Marie, and I all worked, and we also worked with the same consultant then as now. And really, I think what the work, especially tonight, represents is a deeper dive into some of the topics that were kind of addressed in passing or in a very somewhat cursory manner, I would say, in terms of the comprehensive plan LWRS process. So moving on to this topic, moving forward
Oh, I went the wrong direction.
on this topic.
Sorry.
It's interesting, the topic is amend subdivision regulations. I mean, that is as broad as the day is long, right? I mean, it doesn't really offer, in that slogan, very much guidance. But in terms of trying to identify what this meant and understanding the whole process, because I was part of the comp plan and other LWRS, I understood this to have some pretty deep significance for the village. And it's interesting, one of the first things I did when I was assigned or chose this topic was I did a word search for every mention of subdivision in both the comp plan and LWRS documents. And there actually weren't that many of them, but they did sort of all lead to this issue of preserving views and open space and so on. And certainly the conservation subdivision topic relates very directly to amending subdivision regulations. But I think that the touchstone for this topic is Objective 3.2 in the LWRS and comp plan, which is to ensure that areas of scenic significance are protected. And if we move to the next slide, we have that kind of distilled into 5 recommendations in both of the documents that are now almost 10 years old. It's hard to believe, but they are. Preserve scenic views, implement the SAS regulations and integrate them into planning board review, enact tools to mitigate impacts on views, require submission of resource analysis map, and number 5, create scenic overlay districts. And that's really where this topic gets its fuel or its energy from. Now, one thing I would say about these SAS regulations, we refer to them as regulations, and they are in the New York State Regulatory Code Book, but they are not actually regulations in the sense that they tell you you must do this or you must do that. They're really more, or you can't do this. They're really more guidelines. They're on the New York State Department of State website. About 25, almost 30 years ago, the state did a very thorough inventory of the Hudson Valley SAS, which is online. Obviously, it's a bit dated, but there's a very detailed section about the Cold Spring subunit, and I think it was published in '92 or '93. So the village was very different in many ways at that time. It was at the tail end of the marathon remediation. Lots of stuff was happening with the river, with the cleanups up and down the river. But it clearly identified many of the scenic attributes and values of this area that we all cherish. So the process, moving on to the next slide, of course included review of the core documents, reviewing these quote-unquote regulations. And I guess, I would emphasize that these SAS regulations are not self-implementing. I mean, they're not like, you can't just look at the SAS regulations and say, okay, planning board or zoning board of appeals for that matter can't just say, well, applicant, you've violated the SAS regulations or you're not being consistent with them. I mean, I suppose they could say that, but it would be, hard to fit that into, a set of basically aspirational principles. I mean, so the purpose of what we've done with this topic is to give those regulations some teeth. We looked at that SAS encyclopedia that I mentioned, and then we started talking about the features of the village, some of which were covered in the New York State Department of State encyclopedia, others of which were not, that we all feel are, both within the village and outside the village, that we feel are very important. we looked at the feasibility of other protective tools, and I think that's already been covered, and really it came down to the fact that this may be a very important tool that the village could use in the future to achieve the goals that were discussed in terms of protecting open space within areas that may be subject to development in the future, but also to smaller areas, right? Not just subdivisions per se, but to the types of projects that may take place on smaller parcels of land. The purpose of this piece is to protect the features of the Village of Cold Spring subunit of SAS. So we've tied it to these state regulations. So regulations in that sentence, A1 is not in quotations, to preserve the scenic quality of the village. Now, I think it's very important to note in A2, we are protecting public views from public places, right? So it was, we had this great idea, we thought we were rolling with it, and then someone pointed out, well, these types of laws can't and should not be about protecting my view of the mountain from my bathroom window, or my bedroom window for that matter, right? And that's a fair point, right? It's that's something that we don't want to get into with this concept. Now, one could make an argument that that should be part of of this scenic overlay, but that's not what we decided to make it very clear that this only relates to public views from public places. It protects views of certain properties within the village. It also protects views from within the village of certain areas outside the village. So we'll see that in a moment when we get into the inventory. In 2A there does speak to siting and planning of structures that would relate to a larger development project. Sub B, applicability, and this is also very important. Our proposal is that this would apply to applications only for subdivisions or those applications requiring site plan or special use permits. So narrow applicability, potentially, there may be lots of situations in which this does come up, but it's not just, every time someone wants to, well, if you want to change your windows and you're in the historic district, you do have to go to the HDRB, but that most likely would not fall within the ambit of this scenic viewshed overlay proposal. So we actually had, I don't know if fun is the right word, but it was kind of interesting to go through the inventory again. These are things that would in the code language that you all have. This would be part of the consideration, and actually we're giving the planning board more work by saying, this is something that would actually be part of the zoning code or the zoning law, but this would be within the purview of the planning board to administer. And so we have a list of scenic elements, some of which are in the village, some are outside the village, ranging from dockside, the buildings on West Street and Lower Main Street. And that's something we've had some discussion about. Okay, there's potential overlap with the HDRB, which we want to make sure that we keep in our separate lanes, that we're not duplicating effort or making people go through yet more hoops for things that they want to do. But we did believe it was important to include, as part of the scenic inventory, clusters of buildings on a particular street. And those are in fact in the SAS document going back to 1993. And then you see some elements that are outside the village. So moving on to the procedures and standards. So any application for a subdivision, site plan, or special permit, which is called in the draft language a proposed action. For any of those things, the planning board would determine that a proposed action is not likely to impair the scenic beauty of elements, parcels, and structures listed in the inventory. And then the last part of this proposed code language sets forth site development standards. And, just to give you the gist of that, to the extent possible, all structures to be built within this scenic viewshed overlay district, which would encompass the entire village, by the way, shall be sited and clustered to avoid or minimize obstructing of views of the elements in the inventory. I think it's the other thing I wanted to say about this concept is that we are we're trying to make these standards actually are kind of based on a number of sources. They're elements of state regulations or guidance. We also looked at other examples of scenic viewshed overlay districts, including the town of Phillipstown, which was enacted about 10 years ago. It's a very complicated piece of code, and given the level of complication, it was hard to even understand. I mean, frankly, it was hard to even understand how it would be applied or implemented, and just without any empirical, any like solid empirical evidence, but just based on seeing how the ridges of Phillipstown have changed over the years, it seems like maybe that SVO district in Phillipstown, maybe isn't even really enforced. It's just hard. It's hard to tell, but it's one thing we wanted to do here is to try to make it as enforceable as possible. If the village is going to go through the effort of doing something like this, it's got to be as clear as possible so that the village residents, homeowners, property owners know what the expectations are, and that the planning board, which is charged with enforcing this provision, would have clear guidance as to what to do. And so we are recommending that the village board adopt the scenic view overlay in the village code.
So consistency review law, this is one of those curious things that NYSERDA said was to be evaluated. If you don't adopt it, you can't adopt any of the other part of the code, the LWRP, and the other work that had been done in the past. So it's a little strange that it was down as evaluation. And at the same time, the purpose of it is to protect the waterfront. And in order to do that from any kind of agency, whether it's the federal government or the state government or anyone else, you have to have implemented this consistency review law. So it's not really something that was, I don't think we ever really considered it something we weren't going to recommend adopting. I think it was something we always intended to do. So the process that we went through for this was the brief history, right? So this is, I think that kind of went over this, right? This is LWRP, that was the work that was done, and then when it was considered to be adopted, the state came in and said, you can't adopt this because you have to go through these other code update issues, and that's why the whole code update committee was formed, and we've gone through this process. So it's all about adopting this this review law. So. Let's see, what do we have? These are in a different order than the one that was. There we go. So, as I said, the purpose of this is in order to provide a basis for this newly adopted Consistency Review Council. Again, we're going to burden the planning board with this role. We went back and forth, having looked at various kind of prototypes for this consistency review law that were local. We looked at Red Hook, we looked at Rhinebeck, we looked at Ossining. There were different ways that those villages and towns adopted this law and sought to enforce it. But in this case, we're recommending that this Consistency Review Law Council be actually something that is performed by the planning board. Okay.
Let's see, already talked about that, so.
Talked about that. So this one's a very brief topic. I mean, you can see that we've drafted the law. It's actually in the handout, I believe. But we are proposing that it be adopted into the village code. So, happy to answer any questions.
So that concludes our slide presentation. Any questions, any comments?
I can start.
Go ahead, Donald.
So
Oh,
I'm
I'm sorry,
curious,
Aaron. Go ahead.
I'm curious about the application of the demolition proposal. So a structure by the definition here is, it's a fence, it's a pergola, it might be some bird baths, it's pretty broad. And I think it would be good to know when somebody is, we deal with fences a lot on the zoning board, it'd be good to know when somebody is demolishing a fence, because they might be putting up a 6-foot fence, which we don't want. But it seems like a lot of process to go through for some of the smaller structures that.
So you're recommending that it be tightened up to address primary structures?
I guess my recommendation is to consider the wide variety of structures that this applies to and think which ones it really should apply to.
Can you say again, please?
Imagine the wide variety of structures that are encompassed in the definition of structure,
Uh-huh.
and then make sure it's not applying to things you don't want it to apply to.
Gotcha.
The other suggestion I had about this, or question, and I can't find it now, rodents are mentioned.
Yes.
But I wonder if we're also, if we need to mention things like lead paint or asbestos, or if that's handled in the building code or something.
State code talks about how you go about doing that.
So we don't need to
I
deal with that
don't
here.
think you would need to do that in addition.
Okay.
I don't know, I just went through this and I thought it was onerous, but we had to give to the building inspector a hazardous waste, hazardous material report on the building, and what was there, and if there was anything there, if it was gonna be remediated, abated, and how. And then we had to give from the electric company that the power had been turned off. Not that we planned to turn it off, but it was off.
Utilities that are listed in the.
But in yours, you're saying it's a plan for discontinuing.
Uh-huh.
But I think that you might tighten it up, and I would suggest that you tighten it and say that you can't demolish it until you have evidence of the safe off for the electric and for the water, the village water, and for sewer.
Got it.
Do we need to indicate, either on the building permit or somewhere else, whether demolition is part of the project?
Right
Because we've
now,
had an incident where the demolition happened and it wasn't clear.
right now on the building permit, you check a box to indicate that that this is, that demolition is involved. There is-
That's the application?
Yes, the building permit application.
So I'm thinking about something that the building inspector is going to look at.
Well, that's the building application.
When you're going to inspect the project underway, is the yes, there's a demo happening here, box checked?
Okay, so right now, the building permit application has a demolish checkbox. What would you recommend be done differently?
I think I would, if we're going through this process to make sure that the demolition is all in order before it happens, then let's also make sure that the building inspector, who's on the site, knows that a demolition is allowed to happen here. So I think the best way to do that might be the building permit itself, that's right there on the property.
Do you think the best way to do that would be
To have something on the building permit that says demolition is happening here,
Okay, got it.
or demolition is not allowed here.
Oh, interesting, okay.
I go one step further and recommend that you have a demolition permit, one page. It says clearly what you have to do before you can demolish the building.
Even better.
Check off, you know, this is checked off, that's checked off, so the person who's gonna be the demolition, it's crystal clear what they're responsible for before they can demolish the building.
And also, I think it'd be great to tie it to site plan approval, because we've had instances where, you know, to help the applicant and try to be helpful, you know, we give them a demo permit, it's not really a permit, but it's, you know, it's whatever, it's a, you know, but then, you know, with the village is kind of holding hands with, if this application isn't approved, they've already demoed. Silver Spoon, for example, demoed their restaurant without yet having the approval for a change of use to a hotel. I can assure you that the village is gonna get dragged into that if they then say they can't be a hotel and I've already thrown my restaurant out. So I think while we think we're helping the applicants and we're helping compress their schedules, and in some cases we are, I think it comes with a certain risk to not wait to give that demo permit until you have site plan approval. I think ultimately, even though it's a little bit longer, it at least ensures that they haven't wasted time and money, and then the village doesn't kind of get dragged into this, you know, but you knew I was doing this, right?
Today, the process, I come down, so I'm gonna do a flow diagram.
Okay,
I'm a building owner, and I want to, do some interior demolition, and I want to do some interior reconstruction. By definition, the demolition chapter would not get invoked because it's not 80%, it's not substantial. In fact, you're not affecting the exterior of the structure at all, you're only affecting the interior of the structure. So
oh, good point.
So I'm just saying, the demolition that we were talking about here would not be invoked there. But, so, I apply for a building permit, I probably do not check demolish or demolition, because it's interior, not exterior. Now, the building inspector reviews it. Does the building inspector now say, oh, historic district, go to the historic review board? Oh, you need some setbacks, go to this zoning board. Oh, you're looking for a change of use, go to the planning board concurrently. Or is there a process where you can't go to board B until you've gotten clearance from board A?
I think that would be in the best interest of the applicant, because I mean, if you start to talk about the replacement of the historic structure without having the approval of the demolition of the historic structure, right? Or if you need variances that, you know, that are really the gating issue, I mean, I would think there would have to be the building inspector that would decide that path on a case-by-case basis. I don't think you could flow chart it as a one-size-fits-all, because depending on what are really what are the largest issues and what are the gating issues. But I would think
You're suggesting that there be a sequence of reviews that are identified, the sequence is identified based upon the application
right.
by the building inspector.
Right. Because I think that unfortunately what happens, as we all know, is that you come into Village Hall and you sit in front of the dais and you meet with this group and you say it's the village, right? And if it's the HDRD talking about liking your project or loving the shingles or whatever, you have this sense that your project is moving forward as an applicant. The applicant doesn't really fully understand in many cases the purview of just how limited the purview of each board is, right? So then they start they start spending money on design, they start doing things that then incur costs, that then the village is kind of holding hands with them, and then you can't tear it down, or you can't get the variance, or planning board won't give you a change of use.
Right.
So I think that to the best of our ability, I think we should try to figure out what the gating issues are, because all it does is really ratchet up the liability and the anxiety and, for everybody.
So what I've noted is that there should be a sequence. The building inspector is probably the person who determines that sequence, and it should be a serial process.
And if they wanna opt out of it, they just, there's just a notice that's given to them that they proceed at their own risk with respect to, the village is making no representation. If you wanna jump out of sequence and go to HDRB first and start talking about design, right, which obviously typically incurs a significant amount of cost, right, then, that you do that at your own, you do that at your own risk. Just some sort of acknowledgement that the applicant is making the decision to
jump out of line.
yeah, they can, because maybe that's what's most important to them. If I can't get my historic design, if I can't get my modern design approved in the historic district, I don't want to proceed anyway.
Right.
So, I guess you could kind of give them the option to, to kind of choose as well.
Yeah. Got it.
I'm just gonna make the observation that I think the last 5 minutes of discussion and comments have, sort of, they apply to not just this proposed new code, of course, but to the demolition provisions in the HDRB
Yes.
section of the village code, so, I think it's got broader application.
Yes.
I have a question about that too. So is this completely hands-off in the districts, right? This chapter doesn't come into play?
The demolition chapter was not, the demolition is going to be part of 134, and it's probably going to be 134-18, almost all districts, and it'll be C, D, E, whatever, 134-18 is big already. So that's where demolition will apply. It applies to all districts. Now.
So you'd still have oversight on the decisions made by the HDRB?
If you're in the local or the historic district, 64 applies.
Can I ask a question? And I don't want to throw a grenade in the room, but how well do you think it's working? As a committee, the way demolition is processed and approved in the HDRB?
Well, I think the only.
And you don't have to answer that if you don't.
Well, the only two that I'm aware of two. I'm aware of 124 Main, 126 Main, and I'm aware of 33-37 Market. I'm not aware.
I would call it Prisser Building as well.
The which? Oh, the Prisser Building, yes, okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Everything visible from the public right of way was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, so those three. I don't think there have been, in recent memory, there was a demolition at the top of Parsonage Street, 10 to 15 years ago, and they put up a modular home, and it was pretty close to the top. And it was on the east side of Parsonage. I can't remember whose house it was. So your question was, how is it working?
And both sides of the street.
If the question is how is it working? I think that 126 is beautiful. 33, 37, whatever, looks huge. It looks like it's much bigger than it was, but that's just.
And it looks like the one in the back got bigger too, but.
That one was not so obvious that it was demolished.
Right.
And I don't know how that happened.
Right.
I can claim ignorance on that in front of this group. Fran?
2 points. As we talked about the demolition chapter, the discussion went back and forth about interior and exterior demolition. Is there gonna be a place in the code that talks about interior, or is this just specifically going to say, this is about exterior demolition?
This is exterior demolition.
So interior demolition has no.
No. Does someone have to apply for a building permit if they're tearing out the walls in their bedroom and they're gonna put up new sheetrock? Do they have to apply for a building permit now?
Not that I'm aware.
I think the only time it's important is if you're doing a change of use.
If
you're doing a change of use,
Right.
and then it's your gamble.
Or anything structural.
No, but if you're changing means of egress, then you absolutely have to file. And the fact is that when you're filing
Life
this
safety.
drawing, you check off demolition, even if you are just doing interior partitions, because you're submitting a demolition plan.
Well-
So it's not the same kind as the 80, doesn't mean you're automatically doing 80%. You're just acknowledging everyone that you're doing some demolition to rearrange
I suspect
partitions.
that many people who put up new wallboard I mean, now we've got.
Just wallboard that doesn't.
Right, they're not gonna file a building permit, they're just gonna go do it. If they're moving some interior walls, probably that happens without a building permit. But to answer your question, this is demolition of a structure, a major structure, residence, an accessory building, whatever, and we'll have to look at tightening that up, that was a good comment. It does not apply to interior demolition.
On another thing we were talking about, I don't know how it applies here, having a sequence of boards that someone goes to when they're working on a project. Is there a point in time, or I think sometimes it would make sense if we had all the boards together, the person in front of 2 or 3 boards, because, I mean, as we did last night, we're sitting there with someone who's asking us to buy a sidewalk when they haven't gone before planning or HDRB or zoning, and we don't really know what they wanna do with it. So we're, and sometimes it seems to me that if everybody would sit together, to speak to a client, at least.
It would be, in my opinion, it would be difficult to have a client or an applicant supply one application that would then be reviewed by the combined set of boards. Because the HDRB is going to be talking about this detail of that and that, whether or not it's an OG shape or whatever, and Aaron's gonna say, okay, what's your footprint, how far are you from there, what's the size of your house? They're talking about such different topics.
I can see not getting to the nitty gritty of, the little.
But that's what the HDRB does.
But they also are going to get to a point of changing the front facade of a building. We're taking out this door, moving it up and making it wider, moving this window, so maybe the general, well, they wanna do that, they wanna buy the sidewalk, they wanna do something with a carport that isn't long enough to put 2 cars in, I mean, who says what to who?
Well, relative to whether or not the carport is big enough for 2 cars, it's not. The village board was acting upon a request from an architect for their client to buy property in front of the building. And the village board's, in my opinion, the village board's decision was, yes, we're willing to sell, or no, we're not willing to sell. And the village board said last night, we're not willing to sell because it sets a precedent. Anyone can come along and say, I wanna buy a portion of the sidewalk in front of my building. This particular instance, they wanted an entranceway because they were raising the first floor of the building by 2 feet. Because they're in a flood zone, so that's, you're in a flood zone, so you wanna raise the building. And so they needed steps to get into their building. And the most practical way to do that is to build the steps on village property. So they're asking to buy some amount of village property. But in terms of whether or not the building is large enough to accommodate the requisite 2 spaces of off-street parking, that's planning board's decision. Whether or not the egress to the apartment through the carport, where it's barely wide enough for someone to squeeze out of their car, that's, I think, zoning's decision. It's either zoning or planning board. If the roof line, if they wanna project a roof over the entrance to the building, that's, I don't know that, zoning would get involved in it, but HDRB would definitely be involved in that. And I don't think the village board cares.
No, but we sort of gave the opinion, we sort of gave the impression that we did.
Because of the precedent, right?
Well, because we asked for drawings and stuff, but, okay, another topic, another time. I'm just looking at all the stuff that was presented, and somebody walking away thinking that, okay, this looks halfway decent, I mean.
I hope Judy did not walk away yesterday because she showed us nothing.
Mm-hmm.
She showed us a plan that took advantage of 37 feet wide and 7.5 feet deep, and we said no to that. So, in my mind, we don't have anything that we're looking at right now. She's supposed to come back with another proposal, and I hope she heard when I say what we're looking for is minimal. minimal amount of land for you to purchase, not a 24-foot ramp going up 1 inch every foot, or a wheelchair to get in, and then an 8-foot square landing pad.
And the concern just is because then it's going under roof and it's essentially, the stoop sales are typically just flat land right in front of the building, you know, that they.
Raised land.
Or raised a bit, yeah, raised as a stoop, right? You know, sometimes a few inches, sometimes a few foot, but in this case, it's actually a porch going under roof, right? Or that's what she's proposing.
That's what
Yeah,
she had
yeah.
been proposing, right.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether she will still propose that, because she was saying, oh, the roof line will be terrible. I really don't care about that. If you're asking the village board to sell you land, I really don't care about what the roof line looks like. And if you're concerned about the roof line, you're an architect, fix it. You know,
Yeah.
make it look good. It's not the village board, we're not.
Well, other than some sort of, it being implied somehow that the village board supports the expansion of the building and the roof line, right? By selling them the land to do it,
Well,
right?
they could, okay, so let me pose this one. I have I own that building, and I'd like to put out in front of the building, which I am entitled to do, I'd like to put tables and chairs in front of the building. Why can't I project the roof out? What would zoning say about that?
There's a certain limit that you can project your roof line over the side of your building. If you go over that, then that counts as stretching your building out, and you would need a variance.
So zoning would say no.
Well, we'd say you have to apply for a variance.
Oh, okay, but you would hear the variance.
We hear all the
All
variances,
variances
yes.
are heard, yes.
And what would be your inclination on that?
I would have to look at the exact case, I don't know.
At this point, the building is on the property line, but if we sold the front, then she has some.
If we sold the property that she wants, she then owns that property, she can do whatever she could put up a 2-story building that's 7 feet deep and 30 feet wide, if we sold her the property. She could do that.
With a variance,
Hmm?
with a hell of a variance.
With the
yes.
variance.
With a variance, you'd be hard pressed to turn her down, because every other structure on Main Street is on the property line.
And it would probably make sense for her to be on the property
Hmm?
line. It might make sense for her to be on the property line.
So if she built the
She is
land,
now.
she could build on the property line.
Yeah, but those are pre-existing non-conforming, would be mine.
We'd have to look at it.
Okay, so let me challenge that. The 126 Main must have gotten a setback variance.
Yes. No, I think you're right. I think when you want the rhythm of an even plane,
Yeah,
yeah.
and, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
just
I
to,
guess just-
to
just a-
address the bigger question that you were looking at, not the specific case you're talking about, which I didn't care about, was that in some municipalities, you go to the building inspector, and the building inspector goes through and says, in order to accomplish what you describe you want to do, and it is purely descriptive, there's no drawings or anything connected to it, you have to see the HDRB, you have to see the zoning board, you have to see the planning board, you don't have to do this, you have to do a full EAS. It tells you exactly what steps you have to do, not necessarily in an order, but what steps you have to achieve in order to do what you want to do. And it is pretty cut and dry. It's like, well, this engages the planning board, that engages the zoning board, or it doesn't. And they tell you right then what it is you have to do. So it's called an RFI. And then you get it back and you say, well, this is what I have to do. And it's very clear. Very helpful. Frankly.
So maybe this is in the next phase of this
Right.
work, amend the village
Yeah.
code for clarity and consistency. No, seriously, it's, I mean, you know, it's
Consistency, yeah,
Mhm.
just sort of taking away the last,
clarity.
distilling the last 10 minutes of the conversation. I mean, I think there's a lot of good points made about, you know, communicating, you know, to applicants for projects, you know, at a minimum, the steps that they need to go through, even better, the order in which they need to go through the steps, but making it absolutely clear that if you fail to go through all of these steps and get all these approvals, you know, whatever language, you know, warning, 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 you may waste a lot of money, and you should not view approval or positive statements from one of these bodies as endorsement of your entire project. I mean, I think that, you know, and I don't know if that's what the RFIs and that
Yeah,
you're
even
talking
adding that
about
language to an
say.
application would be helpful,
Yeah.
you know?
And putting it on the permit.
Well, for those RFIs, it means if you haven't, the building inspector gets the drawings, he looks at the list, you haven't done them, goes back, you don't get it, right? It's a checklist. You have to satisfy
But
those
also,
criteria.
when you get involved with multiple boards, there's no cookie cutter,
That's what, yeah,
you know,
process.
procedures. Do step one, step two, step three.
That's right.
Each project's different, what boards sit. You've got people on a board, they're not potted plants, they're people, they're human beings. Everybody's gonna have an opinion. The applicant has to go in there and they have to be pliable. They've gotta listen to what people are telling them and they have to then see how to thread the needle to make it work. They can't just have, there's no, if there was some cookie cutter exact way to do it, you know, it would be a different world, but it's not. So there's a little bit of,
It seems to me that about 4 years ago, we had a meeting between the planning board, the zoning board, and the HDRB. And we reached some agreements about how the process would handle various applications. I don't have that remembrance of what the agreements were, but some agreements were reached and we thought it was all very practical. I'll have to go back and take a look at it.
And it is better, it is definitely better. We've even had, I think, 1 or 2 kind of joint meetings to try and get the applicants through faster and more efficient. Like if the impacts from our side are very minimal, or another board are very major, seeker helped a little bit, right? And especially, but with the current changes in seeker for this year, it used to be anything in a district was a type 1 and required coordinated review. That forces you all to kind of get in order because the underlying boards can't take a final action until the lead agency has declared, right? So that forced an order, but that's not the case as of January 1. If it's in the district, it can still be a type 2 exempt. So now we're back to not being forced into an order.
So, that's all. Any other comments or questions? Judith?
I just want to say I'm very grateful that you addressed the SASS because way back in 2004 when we started talking about this, that was a big issue. And it's about time. So thank you. That was
Thank you,
really
Judith.
good.
Anyone else?
Regarding the overlay district and the scenic views, so I think it does make sense for, to consider that for subdivisions, but I wonder if you also considered how that is affected, how those areas are affected by zoning decisions.
I'm sorry, the first part of the SASS overlay.
Let me make
What
sure I
did you
have
say
it.
about that?
Um,
The scenic view overlay
Right,
is going to identify those 13 or so properties that
and
you
you
saw on the list.
want to protect them,
Right.
but only during subdivisions.
No.
Is anything?
During
I think it's any-
subdivision,
I thought it said
change
that-
of use,
Any
and
action, yeah.
I
special
wasn't
permit.
clear on that.
Okay, so that's gonna leave out, making your non-conforming 1.5-story house into a non-conforming 2.5-story house that now blocks the view from
If-
various
If
mountains.
it blocks the view of one of the scenic, one of the 13 or so, from a public right-of-way, if it blocks the view from a public right-of-way, yes, it will.
So that then triggers as,
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that, you know, as we have currently drafted the language, it would actually not include that
Correct.
scenario, so, yeah,
But that's what we want to protect.
yeah, so.
So that then says that any height variance,
That's
is it any height variance?
change of,
Or
change
is
of
it
roof
any,
line?
well, that's an interesting question. Is it triggered by any new construction? So take, for example, the Daily house. They had a double lot
Mhm,
and they expanded their house onto the empty lot.
mhm.
They could have done that without a variance because the lot was big enough, but they wanted to make it, in order to make it, the two sections of the house match, which is what the HDRB wanted, they had to go into the setback, so then they needed a variance. So I guess my question is, and that definitely blocked view of the mountain from the street. So with or without it, so my question is,
From portions of Garden Street, if you were standing on one side of Garden Street, it probably wouldn't. If if you're standing on the other side, the daily side of Garden Street, it would.
If you were standing on the sidewalk on Garden Street, you can see where there, I'm not saying that I don't support the project or anything, I'm just commenting on the fact that if you stand on Garden Street, you can see that that house is now blocking some of the mountain.
It's blocking some of the mountains,
Mhm.
yes.
So that would trigger this.
But from what we've said, no, it would not, because right now it's subdivision, change of use, and special permit.
Oh,
None
so
of
there's
those
just a
are
regular
covered on
building
that.
So my
So
question,
are you, just to be clear, are you advocating adding additional
Expanding.
triggers?
well, I'm questioning, I wanna make sure that you thought of it. I'm
Yeah.
not sure that I have a position yet.
Okay.
So I guess there are two things that could trigger it. One would be simply building that, you're adding a conforming section of your house that doesn't require a variance or doesn't require a subdivision. Should that somehow trigger this review?
No,
And then
we just said,
maybe it only
Doesn't-
triggers it if you need a variance, I don't know. Because you already have the house or you already have the property.
well, if
It
you're going
almost seems to
from,
me like
if
a
you're going
taking,
from
though.
1.5 stories to 2.5 stories, you don't need a variance.
And the planning board is gonna have to
Sometimes
like
you
tell
do.
somebody they
It seems like a
What,
can't.
taking.
what
If you
kind
have
of
it for
instances
story.
would you need a
Same
variance to go from
silhouette,
1.5 to 2.5?
you know, it's a big
If it's
lot.
already a non-conforming
Otherwise you
building
can't
and you're
use the
doing
lot.
something that grabs another part of the setback.
But then you're enlarging the footprint. If you've got a 1.5 and you're going to 2.5, your footprint's the same. If you've got 1.5 and you've got 10 by 10, and the second story is gonna be 12 by 12, then yes, you're increasing the
So what I'm
dimensions.
saying is sometimes it does happen, that a variance is needed when there's what looks like none or very minor change.
But
in the
you,
setback.
I'm sorry, I'm more worried about in a situation where a variance is not needed.
Well, I'm just asking to consider both of those situations.
Okay.
I agree with Aaron. I think that's should be, you guys should think about that. I'd also say thank you so much for all your hard grinding work, because I
Yes.
know what it
Yes.
is, and
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
it's big appreciated.
There's always room
Thank
for
you.
you guys to join us again.
So, it would have to go subdivisions, change of use, special permit, or any modification to the footprint of an existing structure, or, any change to the height of an existing structure.
Well, those are all come under the category of area variance, right?
Hmm?
Area variance. So you either have a use variance or an area variance.
Yeah, but if
So-
you can change your height and not have to have it.
That's area. So
No, but the
You
code
might
does,
not need a
the
var-
code
might not
does,
need a variance.
the code doesn't.
I can add a second story without a
Right,
variance.
if any area variance, whether it's height or width
If the
or
code does
setback
not
is triggered.
distinguish.
But sometimes you don't
It's
need a
the-
variance.
The current code doesn't distinguish, the area variance is footprint in the current code. And
That might be a consistency thing, because in most municipalities, an area variance covers anything
it's
that's
not,
height
it's
or
not, it's
area.
not necessarily a
setback.
consistency thing, it's just how we've
How we
defined
word it.
area.
Yeah.
Well, the way the state defines it is you've got two overarching kinds of
Right,
variances.
right.
You have a use variance and you have an area variance. The area variance does not just include the area of your house, it includes where your fence is and the setback, it includes the size of your lot and so forth,
But
Of
if
the
the
height of
height,
your
Height.
house.
All
but
of
the
it.
height of your house, there's a limit to the height of your house.
Yep.
But if I'm currently 1.5 and I go to 2.5, that does not trigger the need for an area variance.
It is the same footprint. It
Pardon?
is
It's the same footprint.
But should it trigger this is the
I think
question,
it should.
Yes, that's, okay.
even if a variance is not made.
Okay. Very good. Anything else? Fran?
Going back to the beginning, when we talked about conservation easements,
Yes.
I'm looking at the definition, and first thing that pops up is it says it's a voluntary legal agreement,
Yeah,
but then it also says that it's binding on all future owners.
Yeah,
So It's
well-
voluntary for just the original owner?
no, it's voluntary. If I want to enter a conservation easement with Michael, once, it's a voluntary act on our parts. Once it's committed, it's in perpetuity.
So if
It
you
doesn't
sell,
go away.
so if you sell the house to me,
Yes.
It's not voluntary on my part.
Oh, yeah, it is.
It's
It's
whether or not you
those
buy,
are the
whether or not
ones-
you buy it.
Because you
You
bought
have,
it.
you have the choice of whether to buy it.
That's right, it is voluntary, no one makes buy it. Yeah.
Both the facade
Buyer
easement
beware.
and a conservation easement go with the property.
Yeah, they run with the
So if
lane.
property is sold and you want it, you have to adhere to it.
Okay, so it's voluntary when you make the first agreement.
They-
And then
they-
it's-
To start
and
it.
it's-
Right, it's voluntary between the two parties, but once enacted, you've got to live with it. And the tax write-off, the tax benefit is only valid for the people that made the original agreement. You pay, there is a tax write-off for conservation easement, so you're probably getting, the conservation easement though, that's in the current owner's.
You probably have reduced property taxes moving forward. in
I
some- in
know
some
for facade
situations.
easement, you've got reduced property taxes. I'm not sure how it affects, how conservation easement affects property values. Do you have any idea?
It does.
Public policy.
No, it does affect the prop, because it does, you're taking away the
The tax
development
stuff.
rights.
Okay.
Right, but it's gotta be reassessed, right?
Yes.
It would affect it if there's
Yeah.
a reassessment.
And you have to have
value
an
of property.
assessor that buys into the whole idea, which
Yes.
they don't all.
Yes, and yes, it's quite a
Because the-
rigid method to establish the value.
But to your point, that the tax benefit of a conservation easement is a federal income tax
Yes,
benefit.
yes.
And I'm not sure if it's state as well, or maybe it's state,
So,
but it's.
so if that's the
it's-
case, if it's
I
federal.
mean, that's why, yeah,
If it's federal income tax, then it doesn't pass on.
correct.
The lower value doesn't pass on to the new owner. I get it a write-off now.
Yeah.
And that's
You're,
it,
you're devaluing your property.
right.
Right.
Because restrictions.
Anything else from anyone?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Everyone in this room seems really super smart, so be patient with me here. Let's say assume I purchase a house that's substandard, let's say because of age, and it's energy inefficient, it's, you know. Assuming I met all the criteria that the town, the village required, could I completely demolish that building and, for argument's sake, say build an exact replica? Would that be possible?
It would be possible, but you'd have to get, building permit, the building inspector.
Right, as long as, assume everything was,
Yes,
all the criteria was met, was approved by the, you know, historical,
yeah,
you know, I
it's
mean,
possible,
it's possible to do
it's
that?
possible.
You could modernize an old building and still keep the,
It's possible.
yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
Anything is possible. Everyone, thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did it. Woo.